Hi, welcome to my tutorial on ethical theory for machine learning. I'm Nick Schuster. I'm a research fellow in the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University, where I'm a member of the Humanizing Machine Intelligence Grand Challenge, as well as the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory Lab led by Seth Lazar. My current work is funded primarily by a Templeton World Charity Foundation grant for research on moral skill and artificial intelligence, and I created this tutorial for the 2022 ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. Roughly the first half of this tutorial will cover ground that will be familiar to people who are already fairly knowledgeable about technology ethics. The second half will venture into newer territory. I'll use that portion of the talk to develop some of my own ideas about how ethical theory can best inform the development and application of systems built with machine learning. We'll start with the question, what is ethics, or moral philosophy? I'll approach this question by responding to four kinds of skepticism about the nature and scope of ethics: libertarianism, utilitarianism, relativism, and technocentrism. It might seem odd to call all of these views forms of moral skepticism, but stay tuned, I'll explain myself. After that, I'll talk about the relevance of ethics to machine learning and discuss the moral dimensions of data, algorithms, and applications of AI systems. Then I'll consider two broad approaches to ethical ML. First, we can try to make machines good. By that, I mean we can try to make them conform to moral standards as they do the many morally significant things they do: driving cars, surveilling public spaces, processing loan applications, predicting criminal behavior, recommending products and digital content, and many, many, many other things. Second, we can try to make machines make people good. And by that I mean we can try to design and apply them so as to afford good moral agency on the part of their users. I'll also note three problems facing any approach to ethical ML: moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. In brief, it can be hard to determine what counts as morally good or bad behavior in a given situation for these reasons. And since it's difficult to get machines to do complex things even when we have a clear idea of what that is, it will be that much more difficult to get them to do what we want when we don't have a clear idea of what that is. For the remainder of the talk, I'll turn to the question of how ethical theory can best inform the design and application of systems built with ML under conditions of moral risk, uncertainty, and disagreement. And I'll propose a framework for ethical ML that brings together research from philosophy, computer science, and the cognitive and social sciences. So let's start with the basic question. What is ethics? This is a point of contention even among professional ethicists, or especially among professional ethicists. But I think we can say a few things that aren't too controversial. First, ethics is the branch of philosophy concerned with the right and the good. And this means that ethics is a normative field. It deals with questions not just about how things are, but how they should be. Questions like, what should we do? What should we aim to bring about? And what sort of people should we be? It's important to note that questions like these can't be answered simply by looking at how we do act, what we do aim to bring about, or what sort of people we are. Now, of course, empirical evidence can inform ethical inquiry, but it can't ultimately settle ethical questions. For instance, experiments in the cognitive and social sciences might suggest that people tend to do bad things when instructed to do so by authority figures, or that people tend to rely on sub-rational intuition rather than rational deliberation when making certain kinds of moral judgments. But it doesn't follow from this that it's right to defer to authority in morally charged situations, or that it's good to make certain moral judgments through one cognitive process rather than another. Qualitative methods are essential for addressing questions about the right and the good. And researchers who are more accustomed to using quantitative methods may be skeptical about this. Now, there are lots of ways in which one might be skeptical about the nature and scope of ethics. But in my experience teaching ethics to university, high school, and continuing education students, there are four kinds of moral skepticism that seem to be especially popular. And by responding to these, I think we can get a sense of what ethics is all about without having to get into the details of any particular ethical theory. If you have a libertarian streak in you, you're skeptical about the scope of morality. The basic idea here is that people should be allowed to do what they want with minimal restraint. This is a popular view among technologists in particular, and it seems to be motivated there by a resistance to regulation of the tech industry or an interest in empowering individual users, or both. But what should we do when people's interests conflict with each other? Sometimes this doesn't require intervention or even self-restraint. if you and I both own social media sites, and we both want our own site to be the most popular, there's nothing wrong with just going head to head and seeing who comes out on top. But what if our pursuit of social media dominance comes into conflict with our users' interests in things like privacy, autonomy, and well-being? Now, there are well-developed libertarian theories out there that give very plausible guidance about how to negotiate these kinds of conflicts ethically. So my point isn't that libertarianism is a bad ethical theory. Instead, it's just that the highly skeptical and minimalist version of it that says people should just be allowed to do what they want with minimal restraint quickly runs into problems. So even if we take this as our starting point, to end up with a plausible ethical theory, we'll have to say a lot more about what we owe to each other. If you're inclined to avoid that thorny territory, you might be attracted to utilitarian ethics. Now, utilitarianism, like libertarianism, is a well-developed and prominent approach to ethical theory, so it might seem weird to call it a form of moral skepticism. I call it that because utilitarianism is skeptical about the moral import of the kind of individualistic concerns that are central to libertarianism. So, like libertarians, utilitarians aren't skeptical about morality per se, but rather about its scope, or proper subject matter. For utilitarian ethics, what ultimately matters is well-being on the whole. We should just do what's best for everyone. And so individual claims can be overridden when they stand in the way of the greater collective good. This seems to be a fairly common intuition among technologists as well, many of whom believe, for instance, that new technologies should aim to benefit society as a whole rather than enrich and empower the individuals who develop and own them. The question here is, what is best for everyone, and who's to say? The broader social impacts of new technologies are extremely hard to predict, and so it's not at all clear that, for instance, making a new technology free for everyone would actually lead to good social outcomes, all things considered. And even if we could accurately predict the future, we would still have to determine which possible outcomes are best. And since people can reasonably disagree about this, we'll likely have to settle on some morally respectable procedures for negotiating between different conceptions of the good. Again, this is not to say that utilitarianism is implausible, just that any plausible version of it will have to say a lot more than just, we should do what's best for everyone. Now, if you take seriously the fact that people can reasonably disagree about the right and the good, you might be inclined to reject utilitarianism in favor of relativism about ethics. This is a more radical kind of moral skepticism, and one that's very popular among the high school and college students I've taught. But I find that a little prodding often reveals that people who are attracted to moral relativism are deeply concerned about diversity and inclusivity, and so they think that it's wrong to privilege one value system over another. If you agree with that, then you might think that new technologies should be developed and applied in ways that resist rather than reinforce problems like paternalism and colonialism. But notice that this in itself is a strong moral commitment, and it raises important questions like, should all value systems be tolerated? What about those that are intolerant of other value systems, like white supremacy? How should we determine which of the diverse value systems out there are worthy of inclusivity? And how should disagreements among those be negotiated? It's crucial to note here that certain values always come to dominate others. So which ones should dominate? Diversity and inclusivity seem like good candidates. And so moral relativism has some plausibility to it, but beyond the simple claim that no one's values should be imposed on others, it will have to take on quite a few other moral commitments. Finally, technocentric skepticism about morality seems pretty widespread even among those who don't have any particular technical expertise. The idea here is that supposed moral problems often, or always, can be solved by new technologies, at least in principle. For instance, those who are especially optimistic about the promise of AI tend to think that it stands to increase the efficiency of production, distribution, and improvement of every social good from food, housing, and medicine to education, information, and entertainment, to the point where everyone will be guaranteed everything they need to thrive. And at that point, at least the major moral problems of our day and age will be permanently solved. But even if we grant this extremely sunny view of AI, it has to assume one conception of morality or another just to determine what counts as a moral problem in the first place, as well as what would count as a solution. Certainly, it would be good to solve uncontroversial problems like malnutrition, but what kind of food should we produce? How much choice should consumers be allowed, especially when their choices could have adverse effects on health, the environment, and non-human animals? And what about more controversial issues like pornography? Some people think that as long as proper consent has been obtained, adults should be allowed to do whatever they want here. Others think that porn perpetuates sexism and sexual violence. Before we can attempt a technical fix, we have to determine what the moral problem is, if there is one at all, as well as what a good solution would look like. And at that point, we're neck deep in moral theory. I hope these questions have got you thinking about why it's so hard to avoid ethical questions about emerging technologies, particularly those that are built with machine learning. I think it's because technology is inherently practical. From arrowheads to microprocessors, every technology developed by humans has been intended to serve some purpose in some particular way. We now use machine learning to build complex computational systems that serve an incredible variety of human purposes, often in radically novel ways. And since our purposes and the ways in which we pursue them are subject to ethical evaluation, so are the tools we use. We need to ask ourselves, should we be doing this in the first place? And if so, should we be doing it in this way? Let's consider a familiar case. Facial recognition technology raises all kinds of ethical questions, like who should use it? Maybe the state, or private organizations, or just individual consumers? What kinds of ethical worries arise in each case? On whom should these tools be used? Should the state use it on its citizens? Should businesses use it on their customers or employees? Should we only use it on ourselves? And for what purposes should it be used? For espionage or advertising or performance monitoring or personal security? And how should it work? It's worth noting that some ethical problems with facial recognition can be partially addressed by technical fixes. For instance, thanks to digital activism by Joy Buolamwini and others, facial recognition systems have been improved when it comes to recognizing faces of people of different races and genders with similar accuracy. But note that technical improvements like this still leave plenty of important ethical questions about ML-driven systems unanswered. To get a better handle on these questions, let's consider the moral dimensions of three central aspects of machine learning: data, algorithms, and applications. So first, the data used for machine learning can be collected and curated in unethical ways. For example, lack of diversity in training data for facial recognition systems can result in differential performance for people of different races and genders. Even curating based on image quality is problematic here, as many critics have noted, since various camera features have historically been optimized for lighter complexions. So pictures of people with darker complexions are less likely to be high quality, and culling them out results in less diverse datasets. Second, ML algorithms can find patterns in unethical ways, for example, by using someone's postal code to predict their likelihood of being arrested or defaulting on a loan. Even if the correlation is strong, this can amount to disadvantaging people who are already disadvantaged. In fact, because they're already disadvantaged, since postal codes tend to correlate with access to various social goods. Finally, systems built with ML can be applied in unethical ways. For example, recommender systems can be used to keep people engaged with an online platform as long as possible. And even if the data and algorithms used to build such systems are morally unproblematic on their own, using them in this way is arguably unethical, especially if the platform in question has the potential to work against its users' better interests. These are familiar problems in technology ethics, and they demonstrate how ethical theory has proved to be a powerful tool for technosocial critique. But how might we use it constructively to make ML ethical? So there are broadly two approaches we might take to ethical machine learning. First, we can try to design machines to behave ethically. And this might mean various things. Maybe we can encode moral constraints so that systems can only function within those constraints. Maybe we could use moral principles as hyperparameters to guide machine learning. Or maybe we could use data sets that contain examples of ethical and unethical behavior and train the system to distinguish between the two. Lots of interesting possibilities here. Second, we can try to design machines to afford ethical human action. And this might mean making it hard or impossible to use them in certain unethical ways, or maybe they could nudge users toward ethical behavior, or maybe we could use ML to teach a system to identify and privilege its users' higher order preferences, which may be more likely than their immediate desires to represent their considered moral values. Lots of interesting possibilities here too. But whichever approach we take, or however we might try to combine them, we'll run into three problems: moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. The classic trolley problem is illustrative here. Imagine that a runaway trolley is headed for 5 people on the tracks ahead, but it can be diverted onto a track with only 1 person. Is it okay to run down the 1 in order to save the 5? The great Judith Jarvis Thomson was the first to call this the trolley problem, and she pointed out that the people's reasons for being on the tracks can make a moral difference. If the 1 is a contractor who has been hired to work on the track and assured that no trolleys are running today, while the 5 are thrill seekers who hopped a fence covered in warning signs in order to tempt fate, that seems to matter. But not knowing this introduces a moral risk into the equation for the conductor. She might end up doing a serious wrong despite her good intentions. Even without this complication, though, a good and thoughtful person might be uncertain whether it's okay to kill 1 person in order to save 5, and reasonable people can disagree about this sort of thing. These are problems for any approach to ethical ML because they complicate questions about which moral principles or examples of good moral choices we should use. Where reasonable moral disagreement is possible, and it almost always is to some degree, we have to ask, what should be done here? How can we know? And what if we get it wrong? Ethical theory can help us confront these challenges. In the remainder of the talk, I'm going to make 2 moves that I think will point us in a promising direction for ethical ML. First, I'm going to argue that we should focus primarily on the question of how we can use technologies ethically rather than how they can be made to act ethically themselves. And second, I'll argue for a particular view of good human moral agency, which can marshal resources from ethical theory, computer science, and the cognitive and social sciences to confront the challenges of ethical ML. So returning to the 2 broad approaches to ethical ML, design machines to behave ethically or design them to afford ethical human agency, the first looks to be more important for more autonomous systems, while the second looks to be more important for less autonomous ones. But what does autonomy amount to here? Humans are involved at every stage of developing and deploying autonomous systems, and virtually always maintain some level of control over them. So autonomy doesn't seem to amount to anything like free agency for computational systems. Autonomous weapon systems can't go AWOL and join the Peace Corps. Non-autonomous systems, on the other hand, can do lots of things without direct human supervision, and humans often defer to them in a way that amounts to giving them substantial power to act in the world. Algorithms process loan applications and often reject them without any human oversight, and because of their superhuman processing power, their decisions can have far greater social impact than any human loan officer could. So the line between autonomous and non-autonomous systems is blurry at best. Nearly all extant AI systems are autonomous in the sense that they can do things, often impactful things, without direct human supervision, but they're also non-autonomous in that humans design and deploy them for certain purposes and generally maintain at least high-level control over them. They're very sophisticated and powerful tools then, and they can pose unprecedented challenges when it comes to using them well and wisely, but they're still tools and not full-blown agents in themselves. And so while it's important to consider how these tools might be made to function well when unsupervised, the primary ethical concern, I think, is how people use them and how their design and application affect their use. To illustrate this point, think about the controversy around the use of algorithmic predictions in the criminal justice system. Police departments have used predictive systems to decide which streets to patrol, and judges have used them to decide whom to let out on bail. Much of the criticism of these practices has focused on the fairness of the algorithmic predictions, for instance, whether they're based on inadmissible evidence like race or proxies for race. And so even if such predictions turn out to be more accurate than those made by humans, these kinds of factors can make them unfair or otherwise unethical. And this seems to force a trade-off between fairness and accuracy and raises the question of whether we should use such systems at all. This is a real problem. But suppose that instead of asking, should we use these systems, we instead asked, how might we use these systems to make us better moral agents? What if government officials simply use predictive tools like these to target other kinds of social interventions? I mean, really, if we have reason to believe that a crime is likely to be committed on a certain street, or that a certain individual is likely to be arrested in the near future, Shouldn't we ask why this might be and what we might do to prevent these things from happening in the first place? And notice that when predictive systems are used to allocate social goods instead of punishments, it may actually be good to take factors like race into account. Race is a major determinant of life prospects and arguably should be considered when deciding who has the strongest claim on public resources. Again, algorithmic fairness is a serious issue and it deserves the attention it gets, but questions about how AI systems work tend to crowd out what I think are more fundamental ethical questions about how they're used. And I suspect that this is because we have a tendency to treat highly capable systems, especially those that greatly exceed human capacities, more like autonomous agents in themselves than like the tools they really are. And I think that if we approach ML-driven systems primarily as tools, we're in a better position to confront the problems of moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. It's very hard to decide how an automated system should behave under these morally challenging conditions. But people have to act under conditions of risk, uncertainty, and disagreement all the time. And we often manage to act well. So how do we do it? Moral skill is a helpful concept here, since skill in general enables people to cope with risk, uncertainty, and disagreement about what to do in all kinds of practical domains, especially when they have good tools to help them. If a moral skill functions in essentially the same way as, say, skill at cooking or riding a bike, then it makes sense to think about how ML-driven technologies affect us as moral agents in essentially the same way that we think about how cooking implements affect us as cooks. And if we treat our use of these technologies as the primary ethical issue, as I'm suggesting we should, then we also have a promising way into questions about how those technologies should function with or without our direct supervision. Simply put, once we have an idea of how a given tool can help to make us better rather than worse moral agents, we'll also have an idea of how that tool should work. Here are some more details about how this approach to ethical ML might proceed. First, if moral skills function in essentially the same way as other practical skills, then presumably they involve the same basic cognitive capacities, things like attention, memory, reasoning, role-taking, and self-control. The cognitive and social sciences can tell us a lot about how these capacities work and how they help people perform all kinds of tasks. In the case of moral agency, of course, these abilities are put to use for specifically moral reasons. Here, philosophy can offer helpful accounts of moral values like fairness and kindness. And this can help us make sense of the moral dimensions of how we exercise our generic practical capacities. Coupled with a technical understanding of how ML-driven technologies work, this moral skill paradigm gives us a promising framework for ethical ML. For any given application of ML, we can begin by considering which cognitive capacities the technology is likely to affect and how. What are the distinctive affordances of this tool? Next, we can consider how these affordances stand to shape users as moral agents. How do the relevant capacities normally function in the service of moral values? And how might this technology change things? Finally, we can consider how this tool could be designed to enable and encourage users to act morally well rather than making it harder for them to do so. How might our choices regarding data, algorithms, and applications of the resultant system help people to use that system to cope with the risk, uncertainty, and disagreement characteristic of moral life? Here's an example of how such an analysis could go. Recommender systems are ML-driven tools that are likely to affect our attentional capacities because they allocate our attention for us. And we're apt to take their recommendations for granted more often than not, at least given the way they're standardly applied. When we attend to the world around us in a morally skillful way, by contrast, our allocation of attention is guided more or less directly by our values. When we rely on automated systems to allocate our attention for us, then, the connection between our values and what we attend to may well break down. This is both because we don't get as much practice at allocating our attention unaided and because recommender systems try to just predict what we'll click on or view rather than trying to really track our deeper values. So if we want recommender systems to make us better rather than worse moral agents, we need to consider how we might use these tools to attend better to things that matter to us and to attend to them because they matter to us. This has implications for the data sets these systems train on, the algorithms they use to generate recommendations, and the applications of such systems. The data recommender systems use, including user clicks, viewing times, likes, and ratings, don't seem to model users' deeper values and aspirations very well. Can we do better than mere preferences? The algorithms they use tend to aim at predicting how users are likely to engage with content rather than encouraging engagement that users can reflectively endorse. Can we do better than clickbait? And they usually operate behind the scenes to maximize engagement with content. Can we design them to engage users in the recommendation process itself to promote quality of engagement instead of just quantity of engagement? In closing, let's return to moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement, and think about how ethical ML, approached in the way I'm suggesting, can help us confront these problems. We shouldn't try to design systems that guarantee good ethical outcomes. That's just not how moral life works. Living well and wisely isn't plausibly a computational problem, even a highly complex one. But we can design ML-driven systems to help us better navigate the risk, uncertainty, and disagreement characteristic of moral life by assisting the exercise of our practical capacities in the service of our values. And I think this approach to ethical ML has the potential to help us be good people and live good lives without having to settle once and for all what morality requires, which is a doubtful project in any case. Thanks for your attention.